The envelope was already sitting there when I walked into the conference room that Tuesday morning. No handshake, no small talk, just that crisp white rectangle with my name typed across the front like they'd been planning this conversation for weeks. Effective immediately, Rebecca Walsh said without looking up from her MacBook. Your position has been restructured to technical liaison. Compensation adjusted accordingly. That was it. No explanation, no thank you for 28 years of service. Just a new title I'd never heard of and a 40% pay cut from $185,000 down to $111,000. I'm Mike Harrison, 52 years old, and until that moment I was Senior Director of Defense Systems at Blackstone Aerospace. 3 weeks earlier, I'd closed the largest military contract in company history, and $180 billion deal for NATO's next-generation drone warfare systems, with $75 billion in maintenance contracts over the next decade. Total program value, $255 billion. 18 months of flying back and forth to Prague, dealing with Pentagon bureaucrats, and making sure every technical specification could actually keep our pilots alive instead of getting them killed. I should have seen the setup coming. That morning, I'd been reviewing post-contract logistics when Rebecca's office door opened. Dylan Parker walked out first, 28 years old, MIT computer science degree, and already strutting like he owned the building. I'd supervised his training for 2 years, watching him grow from eager intern to competent engineer. Behind him was Rebecca, our 34-year-old CEO, who'd inherited the position when her father stepped down as chairman last year. They were laughing about something, shaking hands like they'd just made some private deal. Neither of them noticed me standing there with my coffee, watching them celebrate something I wasn't part of. Now here I was, holding a letter that had been printed yesterday, telling me I no longer held the position I'd built from scratch over nearly 3 decades. They didn't just demote me, they tried to erase me. Quietly, efficiently, and with 24 hours notice. I folded the letter, tucked it into my jacket pocket, and stood up. I didn't argue because this wasn't the time to fight. This was the time to remember everything, every conversation, every signature, every line of code I'd written into that contract. The nameplate was gone when I got back to my floor. Not moved to Dylan's new office, not updated with my new title, just gone. Where it used to say Michael Harrison, Senior Director, the frosted glass door was blank, like my 28 years at Blackstone had been wiped clean. I stood there for a minute, not sure whether to laugh or put my fist through the glass. A young engineer walked by carrying a stack of technical manuals and did a double take. "You need help finding something, sir?" he asked, genuine respect in his voice. Most of the technical staff still remembered who actually built the systems they worked on. "No," I said, "I'm exactly where I need to be." Then I walked down 3 floors to the basement level, past departments I hadn't visited since I was Dylan's age. That's where they'd set up my new workspace. Not an office, a cubicle. Gray carpet, fluorescent lights that hummed like mosquitoes, and a desk that rocked when I put my coffee down. Someone had left a sticky note on the monitor. "Mike, we'll get you set up by end of day." HR. Not even Michael anymore. Just Mike. I sat in the cheap chair and looked around. On the wall across from me hung the new organizational chart, freshly printed and laminated. I walked over to see if I was still visible somewhere in the company structure. I wasn't. Not at the director level, not in the footnotes, not even listed under project contributors. Dylan Parker had my spot now. Director of Advanced Defense Systems according to his new title. The photo showed him wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, smiling like he'd earned something instead of just being handed it. I closed my eyes and felt something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier to deal with. This was something deeper. The realization that they'd been planning this since month 15 of the NATO negotiations, while I was still bleeding myself dry for their contract. That afternoon, a junior project manager stopped by my cubicle with a stack of folders. "These need to get to Dylan for tomorrow's NATO technical review," she said, handing them over like I was now the office mail clerk. I nodded and took them. As she walked away, I noticed one folder was thicker than the others. Inside was the presentation deck for the drone contract, my contract. The cover slide still had my name and photo from the signing ceremony in Brussels. I remembered that day, shaking hands with the NATO procurement director after 18 months of work that had cost me my marriage, my health, and most of my relationship with my daughter Emma. But someone had taken a black marker and crossed out my face, literally drawn an X over my photograph like I was a target in a shooting gallery. The final version had Dylan's headshot and name instead. I went back to my cubicle and opened the file cabinet they'd assigned me. Inside were binders from the NATO project, contracts, technical specifications, meeting notes, everything I'd organized during 18 months of negotiations that nearly killed me. Except now every tab that used to have my initials, MH, had been changed to DP, Dylan Parker. Like he'd been there for every midnight video call with Pentagon officials, every technical review that saved taxpayer billions, every moment when the deal almost fell apart, and I held it together with pure expertise and stubbornness. I closed the drawer and sat very still. I didn't curse, didn't slam anything. I just let the silence settle in while I thought about my daughter Emma. She was starting MIT in the fall, $80,000 a year for 4 years. My ex-wife Sarah was still dealing with medical bills from her heart surgery 2 years ago. The divorce settlement required me to maintain her health insurance until she turned 65. At $185,000 a year, I could barely manage all that. At $111,000, I was looking at serious financial pressure. Emma's education alone would eat up most of my take-home pay. What hurt wasn't losing the office or seeing my face crossed out with a marker. What hurt was realizing how easy it had been for them to plan this betrayal while I was working 16-hour days to make them rich. During those 18 months, I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night. I'd missed Emma's 18th birthday party because of an emergency NATO security review. I'd taken Pentagon calls from the cardiac unit after collapsing from exhaustion and stress. And there was one Christmas morning when I'd spent 6 hours troubleshooting a guidance system failure instead of opening presents with my daughter. I'd given Blackstone everything. Every hour, every heartbeat, every piece of my soul. And when Lockheed Martin approached me 8 months ago with an offer to lead their military systems division, I'd turned them down flat. I'm loyal to Blackstone, I told them. That $255 billion contract was my legacy. I'd hand-built every technical specification, caught software errors that could have gotten pilots killed, and translated Pentagon requirements into language NATO bureaucrats could actually understand. And at the heart of it all was Clause 23 Alpha. It wasn't part of the standard contract template. It wasn't suggested by our legal team. It came during a dinner in Prague when the NATO technical director, Colonel Andreas Hoffman, leaned across the table and said, "We've been burned before by contractor personnel changes mid-implementation. We need assurance that you'll personally oversee the technical rollout." So I wrote the clause myself. Clean, precise, legally bulletproof. Technical oversight and systems implementation shall remain under Michael Harrison due to top-secret/SCI clearance requirements. In the event of personnel reassignment, NATO reserves the right to void this agreement and seek alternative contractors. They signed it without reading it carefully. We celebrated with expensive champagne. And now the very line I'd written to protect NATO's investment had become my only weapon against corporate betrayal. I leaned back in that wobbly chair and felt something solid and cold settle in my chest. Not rage. Rage was for young men who still believed the world owed them fairness. This was something else, something patient and dangerous. They thought they'd stolen my life's work, but I'd never given it away. The next morning I showed up at 0630, same as I had for 28 years. Old habits die hard. Not because I had to after what they'd done, slashing my salary, stealing my title, crossing out my face like I was yesterday's news. I showed up because they expected me to disappear, walk away quietly or storm out in a rage. That's not how former Air Force majors operate. I grabbed my coffee and walked past Dylan's new office, my old office. He was in there early, probably preparing for the NATO technical review. Through the glass, I could see him studying technical specifications with the intensity I'd taught him to have for weapons systems. The kid had learned well during his 2 years under my supervision. Rebecca walked by my cubicle once that morning. She glanced over but didn't stop, didn't acknowledge me. Just kept walking like I was part of the office furniture now. I didn't chase after her demanding explanations. Instead, I opened my laptop and started making calls. First, I reached out to Tony Rodriguez, a former colleague who'd moved to Northrop Grumman after Blackstone passed him over for promotion 3 years ago. We'd worked together on the F-35 avionics upgrade before he got smart and left. "Mike, good to hear from you," he said. "How's the NATO contract treating you?" "Interesting question," I said. Hypothetically, if someone with deep military aerospace experience became available in the next few months, would that be useful to your team? There was a pause. Tony knew how to read between the lines. What kind of someone? Someone who just delivered a $255 billion deal and still holds TS/SCI clearance. We'd be very interested in that conversation. Very interested. I made similar calls to contacts at Lockheed, Raytheon, and Boeing. Not begging, not desperate, just checking the temperature. Each conversation went the same way. The defense contractor world isn't that big, and people remember who actually gets things done. Thursday afternoon, my desk phone rang. Unknown number, 703 area code, Northern Virginia. Michael Harrison? The voice was crisp, professional, with that particular cadence of career military. Speaking. This is Colonel Andreas Hoffman, NATO Procurement Division. We met in Prague. I sat up straighter. Colonel, good to hear from you. How can I help? I'm calling about the technical implementation phase of our contract. My engineering team has some questions about the guidance systems integration. When can we schedule a detailed review? Well, I said carefully, you'd probably want to speak with Dylan Parker now. He's taken over the technical oversight. Long pause. Then, I'm sorry, who is Dylan Parker? Dylan Parker. He's the new director handling your project implementation. Another pause, even longer this time. Mr. Harrison, with all due respect, I've never heard of Dylan Parker. Our contract specifically requires you to handle technical oversight due to clearance requirements. We're not interested in substitutes on classified systems. I felt something click into place like a round chambering. Let me look into this situation and get back to you, Colonel. Please do that quickly. And Michael? We meant what we said in Prague. This deal is with you personally, not with whoever happens to be sitting in an office this week. Our pilots' lives depend on getting this right. That afternoon, everything started moving fast. An email landed in Dylan's inbox, and mine, since I was still on the NATO technical distribution list. The subject line was simple: contract compliance review, required, urgent. The message was even simpler. Per Clause 23 Alpha, NATO requires immediate confirmation that Michael Harrison remains as Technical Oversight Director. No alternative personnel will be accepted for classified systems implementation. I watched from my cubicle as Dylan's office suddenly became Grand Central Station. Rebecca showed up first, moving fast. Then 2 lawyers from our legal department. Then someone from the executive floor I didn't recognize wearing a suit that screamed damage control. By 1600 hours, my desk phone rang. Rebecca's assistant voice tight with stress. Mike, can you come upstairs? There's been a situation with the NATO contract. I took the elevator up to the executive floor for the first time in 3 weeks. The main conference room was packed. Rebecca, Dylan, our head legal counsel, Patricia Wells, and 2 VPs whose names I'd never bothered learning because they'd never contributed anything useful to actual defense work. Rebecca looked like she'd been chewing broken glass. Mike, we need to discuss the NATO implementation timeline. Sure, I said, taking a seat across from them. What's the problem? Dylan spoke up, voice steady but concerned. NATO is asking for you specifically for technical oversight. I understand the contract requirements, but I was hoping we could work out a transition plan. I looked at Dylan. The kid was handling this better than I'd expected. No arrogance, just professional concern about a complex situation. There's no transition to work out, I said. Clause 23 Alpha requires me personally to handle technical oversight due to my TS/SCI clearance and NATO security requirements. Patricia Wells leaned forward, legal pad ready. Can you walk us through exactly what that clause means, Mike? I pulled out my personal copy of the contract. It's straightforward. NATO requires continuous technical oversight by Michael Harrison due to classified systems integration. If I'm reassigned, they can void the entire agreement. You could have heard a pin drop on that marble conference table. The entire $255 billion program? Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. Base contract plus maintenance agreements, I confirmed. NATO insisted on this protection after getting burned by personnel changes on previous programs. Dylan looked genuinely concerned now. Is there any way to modify the agreement? NATO doesn't renegotiate signed contracts, I said, especially not billion-dollar weapons systems with 24-month implementation timelines. Rebecca stood up abruptly. Can we have the room? Mike, please stay. Everyone else filed out. Dylan was last, stopping at the door. Mike, I hope we can figure this out. This program is too important to lose. When the door closed, Rebecca sat down directly across from me. What's it going to take to fix this? I'm not sure what you mean. To satisfy NATO's requirements. What do we need to do? I looked at her for a long moment. Rebecca, this isn't about satisfaction. This is about contract law and national security. NATO has the legal right to cancel the program if I'm not running technical oversight. So what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm explaining what we already agreed to. And if we can't meet their requirements, then you lose the biggest defense contract in company history, along with any chance of future NATO business. She was quiet for almost a minute, probably calculating what that would mean for her first year as CEO. Your previous position, she finally said. Full restoration, director title, $185,000 salary, corner office, everything exactly as it was. Would that satisfy NATO's requirements? I stood up slowly. I'll need to think about it. Mike, we need an answer by tomorrow morning. NATO is expecting our response. Then you'll have one. I left her sitting there and took the elevator back down to my gray cubicle. My phone was already buzzing with a text from Tony Rodriguez. Word is there's some turbulence at Blackstone regarding the NATO deal. Our offer is still open. I looked around that basement workspace, at the organizational chart where my name had been erased, at the stack of folders with someone else's initials on work I'd done. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's just letting people live with the consequences of their own poor planning. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was stressed, because I was calculating. At 52, you learn the difference between panic and planning. At 05:45 the next morning, my phone rang. Unknown number, but I recognized the area code. 202, Washington, D.C. Michael Harrison? The voice was crisp, authoritative. Speaking. This is General Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Defense Acquisition Office. I believe you know why I'm calling. I sat up in my kitchen chair, coffee mug halfway to my lips. Good morning, General. I'll cut to the chase, Major Harrison. NATO briefed us yesterday on the situation at Blackstone, a $255 billion weapons program hanging by a thread because someone decided to play corporate musical chairs. She'd used my old rank. That meant she'd done her homework. That's an accurate assessment, General. Here's what's going to happen. We're prepared to offer you a direct consulting contract with DoD, $320,000 annually, full benefits, top secret facility access. You'd oversee NATO drone implementations across all allied nations, not just this contract. I was quiet for a moment, running the numbers. Emma's MIT tuition was $80,000 per year for 4 years. Sarah's ongoing medical monitoring was another $15,000 annually. At $111,000, I couldn't cover both. At $320,000, I could handle everything comfortably. When would this start? Today, if you want it. We'll have paperwork ready by 1,000 hours. But Mike, I need to know, are you still loyal to Blackstone, or are you ready to serve your country properly? I've always served my country, General. The question is whether Blackstone deserves my loyalty. Think about it, but don't think too long. NATO wants this resolved before their defense ministers' meeting next week. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking out at the sunrise. Emma would be getting up soon for her final semester of high school. Her MIT acceptance letter was still pinned to the refrigerator, a reminder of what was at stake. I got dressed and drove to Blackstone one last time as an employee. Rebecca was waiting in the main conference room at 0800 sharp. Dylan was there too, looking professionally concerned but not panicked. The legal team had grown overnight. 6 lawyers around that table, plus someone from corporate security. Mike, Rebecca started before I'd even sat down, we've prepared a complete restoration package. Full director title, $185,000 salary, corner office with a view, executive parking, and a $20,000 signing bonus. I nodded. That's generous. Dylan looked relieved, probably thinking his new position was secure and the program would continue smoothly. But I'm not taking it, I continued. The room went dead silent. I'm resigning effective immediately. I've accepted a position with the Pentagon as Senior Technical Advisor for NATO weapons systems implementation. Rebecca's face went white. Mike, you can't do this. The contract specifically requires you personally. Actually, it requires Michael Harrison to handle technical oversight. It doesn't specify that Michael Harrison has to be employed by Blackstone Aerospace. One of the lawyers started frantically flipping through contract pages. Patricia Wells looked like she wanted to disappear. The Pentagon reviewed the contract language last night, I continued. As long as I'm overseeing technical implementation, NATO's requirements are satisfied. My employer is irrelevant to weapons system performance. Dylan spoke up first, his voice steady. What happens to the implementation timeline? I looked at him. The kid had grown during his 2 years under my supervision, from eager intern to competent engineer who understood the stakes. Dylan, you'll handle program management for Blackstone, schedules, budgets, contractor coordination. I'll handle technical oversight and classified systems integration from the Pentagon side. If you stay focused and keep learning, this will be the best engineering education you could get. And NATO's contract stays valid? Blackstone keeps the contract they already signed. They just don't get to keep me. Rebecca stood up slowly. What's this really about, Mike? The money? I thought about that question. About 18 months I'd sacrificed for that NATO deal. About missing Emma's birthday party for emergency technical reviews. About divorce papers that cited my work. Obsession as a primary factor. It's about respect, I said finally. You had someone who delivered the biggest defense contract in company history. Someone with 28 years of military and aerospace experience. And your response was to demote him and cut his salary by 40%. We can match any offer. It's too late for matching offers. I stood up and headed for the door. My Pentagon liaison will contact you about implementation protocols. Dylan, clear your calendar for the next 24 months. This is going to be intensive. I walked out of that conference room and took the elevator down to my cubicle one last time. Everything I cared about fit in a small box. Some technical manuals, a photo of Emma at her high school graduation, and my original copy of the NATO contract. As I was packing, Dylan appeared at my cubicle entrance. Mike, I want you to know I never asked for your position. I was just trying to do good work. I looked at him. Dylan, you did do good work. That's why you're ready for this challenge. What do you mean? NATO isn't paying $255 billion for PowerPoints and meetings. They're paying for weapons systems that work when pilots are getting shot at. You understand that now. He was quiet for a moment. Will you help me learn what I don't know? Kid, I'm going to make sure you succeed. Not because I work for Blackstone anymore, but because those pilots deserve someone who takes this seriously. 6 months later, I was sitting in my Pentagon office reviewing Dylan's quarterly technical reports. The implementation was ahead of schedule. His reports showed careful attention to detail and growing confidence in complex systems integration. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Dad, Dean's List. First semester at MIT. Thanks for making this possible. Another message from Sarah. Mike, cardiologist says my heart function is back to normal. Thank you for maintaining the insurance coverage. I looked out my office window toward the Potomac River. Blackstone had survived the transition, though they'd lost 2 smaller contracts due to client concerns about personnel stability. Dylan had stepped up impressively, earning respect from both NATO engineers and Blackstone management. My desk phone rang. Michael Harrison, Pentagon Defense Acquisition. Mike, this is Colonel Hoffman. Quarterly review shows all systems performing above specifications. NATO command is extremely satisfied with the implementation. Outstanding, Colonel. That's what we aimed for. There's something else. We're developing specifications for next-generation autonomous combat systems, $500 billion over 15 years. Would you be interested in leading the technical evaluation? I leaned back in my chair. At 52, most guys my age were thinking about winding down. I was about to take on the most complex military technology program in history. Send me the preliminary requirements, Colonel. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's proving they never understood your value in the first place. Rebecca Walsh had tried to reduce me to a $111,000 technician. Instead, she'd freed me to become a $320,000 Pentagon advisor responsible for the future of military technology. At 52, I wasn't ending my career. I was finally starting the chapter that would define it. 18 months later, I was standing in the Pentagon briefing room watching Dylan Parker present the final NATO implementation report to a room full of generals and defense ministers. The kid had come a long way from the eager engineer who thought 2 years of experience qualified him for everything. System performance exceeded all benchmarks, Dylan was saying, clicking through slides with quiet confidence. 0 targeting errors, 99.7% operational availability, and implementation completed 4 weeks ahead of the 24-month timeline. Colonel Hoffman nodded approvingly. Outstanding work, Mr. Parker. But then Dylan did something that showed he'd learned more than just technical skills. Sir, I need to clarify something. This success belongs to Major Harrison's original design and ongoing oversight. He wrote every critical specification and caught every system integration error. I managed the execution. The room turned to look at me. I gave Dylan a slight nod, respect earned and properly acknowledged. After the briefing, General Hayes pulled me aside. Mike, that young man gives you full credit for the program's success. Dylan earned his reputation. He learned that engineering isn't about being the smartest person in the room. Speaking of reputations, I have news about Blackstone. I waited. Rebecca Walsh was removed as CEO last month. Board cited strategic leadership failures. Losing the Patterson Air Force contract and the Australian defense deal after the NATO situation didn't help her case. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication. Just the quiet acknowledgement that poor decisions have consequences. What about Dylan? NATO specifically requested him for their next-generation UAV program. Seems his reputation for thorough technical management has spread. That evening, I drove to Emma's MIT campus to take her to dinner. She was finishing her sophomore year in aerospace engineering, maintaining a 3.9 GPA while working in the university's Advanced Propulsion Lab. Dad, Professor Williams wants me to apply for the NASA Goddard summer internship, she said over dinner. It's competitive, but she thinks I have a strong chance. What do you think? I'm nervous. It's a big opportunity, and I'll be competing with students from everywhere. I looked at my daughter, 20 years old, brilliant, determined, everything I'd hoped she'd become. Emma, competence beats confidence every time. You don't have to be the smartest person there. You just have to be the most thorough and most reliable. Is that how you survived what happened at Blackstone? I'd told her the whole story over winter break. She'd listened carefully, asking technical questions about contract law and Pentagon procurement. I didn't survive it, I said. I used it. Sometimes what feels like the worst thing that could happen becomes the thing that shows you what you're actually worth. Because you ended up at the Pentagon? Because I learned the difference between being valued and being valuable. Blackstone valued my productivity. The Pentagon values my judgment. After dinner, I drove home to my Arlington apartment. On the kitchen table was a stack of technical specifications for the new $500 billion autonomous weapons program. 15 years of development covering everything from space-based surveillance to deep-sea drones. My phone rang. Dylan Parker. Mike, I wanted to update you on something. Blackstone offered me Rebecca's old position. CEO? That's a significant responsibility. I turned it down. I was surprised. Why? Because I realized something working with you on this program. I don't want to manage a company. I want to build systems that work when people's lives depend on them. I accepted a position with Lockheed as Senior Technical Director. That puts us on opposite sides of future procurements. Good. That means the government gets the best possible systems, because neither of us will accept anything less than perfect. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and started reviewing the autonomous weapons program requirements. The scope was staggering. AI systems that could make targeting decisions in milliseconds, integrated across every military domain. At 54, I was about to oversee the most complex military technology program in history. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Mike, Emma told me about your promotion to program director. I'm proud of how you turned everything around. Another message from Tony Rodriguez. Heard you're running the autonomous systems evaluation. Northrop is bidding on the satellite integration. May the best proposal win. I closed my laptop and walked to the window overlooking the Potomac. Across the river, lights from defense contractor offices reflected off the water. Somewhere in those buildings, engineers were working late preparing bids for programs that would define military technology for decades. 2 years ago, I'd been sitting in a basement cubicle watching someone else get credit for my work. Tonight, I was responsible for a program that would employ 75,000 engineers and determine how America defended itself for the next generation. Rebecca Walsh had made a critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that destroying my position would destroy my value. Instead, it freed me to discover what I was actually worth. My daughter was thriving at MIT, studying to become the next generation of aerospace engineers. My ex-wife was healthy and financially secure. Dylan had learned that engineering excellence requires both technical skill and personal integrity. And I was about to lead the most important defense technology program of the 21st century. At 54, I wasn't winding down my career. I was hitting my peak. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even with people who betrayed you. Sometimes it's building something so significant that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. Sometimes it's proving that they didn't break you. They just freed you to become who you were meant to be. Rebecca Walsh had tried to erase me from one company. Instead, she'd launched me into a position where my decisions would shape an entire industry. If that's not justice, it's something better.